Welcome everyone, alumni and friends and former faculty and current faculty. Great to have everyone here tonight. My name is Dolores Ocampo Brown and I am the Senior Director of Alumni Engagement at Carroll. And I'm an alumna as well, as many of you are. And so I'm really excited to be here with all of you tonight for this very important discussion. And I'd like to thank and welcome our panelists, Sandra Bagley and Dorval Carter. Thank you both so much for being here. Dorval is the president of the Chicago Transit Authority and chair of the Carroll University Board of Trustees. And Sandra is the frontline leader of Customer Contact Center with Humana. So thank you both for being here tonight and sharing your expertise and your experience with all of our guests tonight. Dorval and Sandra were at Carroll concurrently. They overlapped time here. So Dorval is a class of 79 and Sandra is the class of 1980. So before we begin, I want to just give a brief overview of the event tonight. So we are going to begin with some introductions of our featured panelists and then move into some questions, of course, and gather their expertise and experience. And then we'll reserve some time for Q&A from our participants. I want to be able to take some time to define intersectionality. So intersectionality is a research approach and tool that explores the interaction of different social categories related to an individual's identities such as race, ethnicity, gender, age, class, religion, national origin, and sexuality. These categories might be fixed, such as race and ethnicity, or they could be fluid, such as geography, occupation, or migration status, and other things. They intersect in dynamic and interactive ways to privilege or oppress different people depending on their characteristics and contexts. These categories do not exist in isolation. They interact collectively to affect our experiences and behaviors in relation to inequality, justice, exploitation, and oppression. Intersectionality becomes a powerful tool for effectively addressing human rights violations. And we will be viewing intersectionality as it relates to the two industries that Sandra and Dorval represent, which are essentially healthcare and transportation. So as we begin, Dorval, Sandra, can you please take some time to introduce yourselves? How did you get to Carroll? What was your major? What was your Carroll experience like? Dorval?
Okay, thank you. As Dolores indicated, I went to Carroll and graduated in 1979. I'm originally from Chicago and heard about Carroll through some friends of mine. And I was looking for really a small school that was far enough away for me to be away from home, but not too far away that I couldn't go home when I wanted to. And Carroll geographically fit the bill for what I was looking for. While at Carroll, I majored in business administration with a minor in economics, which is how I know Professor Olson because he was one of my professors during my time here. My experience at Carroll was very positive. I learned a lot. I particularly appreciated the support that I got from the faculty here at Carroll, who really who really viewed you as an individual and really supported you during your time at the school here. And for me, that was very important because I started off as a pre-med student and rapidly determined that pre-medicine was not going to be my cup of tea and had to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life during my tenure here at Carroll. And certainly I got a lot of help to figure that out and ultimately went on to business administration. And then after graduating from Carroll, I went to law school. I graduated from law school in 1983, and then came back to Chicago to begin my legal career, which started at the Chicago Transit Authority. I started there as a staff attorney. I filled a number of positions there and then eventually left to go work in the federal government. I spent a number of years in the federal government, then came back to CTA as an executive. And then I left again in the most recent stint to become a political appointee in the Obama administration, where I served in numerous roles and eventually served as chief of staff to the Secretary of Transportation before coming back to CTA to be the head of the agency. which is the position that I'm in right now. So I have over 30 years of experience in transportation and in transportation policy, and really look forward to having this conversation around intersectionality in transportation.
Okay, and I'm Sandra Bagley. I graduated in 1980 from Carroll. My resume probably isn't as illustrious as Dorval's is, but I have a lot of experience in activism, social justice, those sorts of things. I learned about Carroll when Shirley Hilger back in the days visited my high school in Beloit, Wisconsin. And also my family was Presbyterian. And of course, Carroll at the time, and I assume still does, have some affiliations with the Presbyterian Church. And so there were some scholarships afforded to me, and also my pastor really wanted me to see if I could attend Carroll. My background or my degree is in sociology, but I like Dorval. I started in a medical track also. But once I got into the chemistry lab, I soon discovered that this was really not the road I wanted to take. So I took a semester and did a lot of different courses. I took some courses in the religion department and some in the art department, and, you know, just really figuring out what I wanted to do. And I finally settled in the social sciences area at Humana, which I think really did open my eyes to a lot of things that I hadn't experienced before. As coming from a family where I was kind of, I don't know what the word is, sheltered, maybe I didn't know as much about the bigger world. So definitely Carroll was a great experience for me, and really sparked that note in me around social justice and activism. My career journey really is, once I got out of college, I worked in retail for a number of years. Through one of my retail opportunities, I ended up in New England, where I lived for 19 years, in New Hampshire, and then later in Massachusetts. I worked for a furniture company and managed a furniture showroom for quite a few years in the Boston area. And of course, coming from Wisconsin, and then moving into an urban area for me was very eye-opening. And I learned a lot of things and met a lot of people that I had never met before. And I think that's what really got me involved with the LGBTQ community, because working in the home furnishings industry, there were a lot of gay salespeople and designers and, you know, people in the showroom. So that was really my first experience, really being immersed in the LGBT. Well, at that point, it really was LBG. The T and the Q and all of that hadn't really come to fruition yet. But I lived in Boston area for 19 years. I moved back to Green Bay in 2004. And in 2006, started to work for Humana, health insurance company, where I have had so many opportunities with Humana, aside from what I call my day job, to become involved in their inclusion and diversity initiatives. And really, they have quite a few what we call network resource groups. Some companies call them business resource groups or employee resource groups, but at Humana, they're network resource groups. And I have been a co-leader in the Pride network resource group for about 7 years now. So that is really where my passion for inclusion and diversity and my knowledge of intersectionality and all of that comes from. Also in Green Bay, I, over the last 6 or 7 years, have really met some like-minded people. It took a while in Green Bay. Green Bay is not necessarily the most diverse community, but finally I was able to meet some like-minded people and get involved and really revisit my social justice, I guess, initiatives and really my love of activism in terms of really being a proponent for underserved populations. So that's me.
Thank you so much for your introductions, Dorval and Sandra. So as we delve into the main topic of today, examining intersectional inequalities, how would each of you describe how intersectionality exists and affects outcomes in healthcare and transportation? We'll let Sandra go first this time. Sandra.
Okay. Well, when it comes to healthcare, how I look at it as there are many different layers. And of course, you know, there are marginalized communities. And it just seems like the more of these communities you're a member of, the more difficult it is when it comes to healthcare. You know, I always say for most of it, it's very difficult to find maybe a doctor you relate to. It's very hard to find a physician that you feel comfortable around. But for me, and I'll just speak to what I know the best, is if you are part of the LGBTQ plus community, it's even more difficult because not all physicians are open necessarily to all the needs of that community, and especially speaking to the transgender community. And then you talk about age a little more, or you talk about being a transgender person of color, and it just gets to be more and more complicated. So when it comes to health disparities, I mean, certainly LGBTQ plus older adults experience health disparities really in 4 areas. One is access to healthcare, HIV and AIDS treatment, mental health treatment, and then treatment of their chronic physical conditions. So, you know, it's maybe more difficult for them to find a doctor that relates to all of their needs. Also, when you start talking about the transgender population, there are a lot of people who are transgender who have a hard time maybe finding a job because their gender or their appearance doesn't necessarily match the name on their driver's license, and so it makes it more difficult for them to find a job. And then they don't necessarily, without a job, have access to healthcare. There are clinicians who really aren't very open to treating transgender people. So, you know, that in and of itself is quite difficult. But when you start talking about, you know, people who, on top of that, are Black or Hispanic, it becomes even more complicated. And the treatments and the, I guess, opportunities they have for treatment become less and less. That's all for now.
Thank you, Sandra. Well, what about your perspective for transportation?
Sure, I think you start off in the transportation world. You start off with the fundamental understanding that mobility is a fundamental right, and it is so foundational to so many other things that we talk about that impact the quality of individual lives. That includes healthcare, that includes employment, that includes you know, the ability to get to a grocery store, which may or may not be in your community because you live in a food desert. The issues around mobility are probably foundationally all around intersectionality, as you discuss it, because the role that transportation plays, particularly public transportation, is really defined to try to provide that level of access to mobility to address the communities that don't have the options or the quality of transportation that people who are in better financial situations or in communities that create more options for mobility may have. And it plays itself out in very interesting ways, because in a city like Chicago, I'm dealing with a transit system, the rail portion of which is over 125 years old. And as you can imagine, when the rail system was built, it was not built with any thought to the type of things that we talk about today when we discuss concepts like environmental justice, Title VI, and equity, in terms of where it serves and how it serves. And so you really have a tale of two cities in Chicago. You have the communities that are well situated with multiple options to take rail service to get to and from the places they need to go very effectively and efficiently. And then you have areas of the city for which there is no rail service, for which the bus service is the only way in which they get around. And when you start looking at what that means in terms of barriers, you start looking at the fact that in certain parts of our city, you can get to work within 20 minutes by hopping on a train, taking that train downtown, and getting off to go to work. Where in other parts of the city, that same commute to get downtown to work may take 2 hours. Why? Because you have to get on a bus. You got to take that bus to another bus. You have to transfer that bus. You got to take that bus up to a rail station. And then you have to get on the rail system and take the rail system all the way to where you need to go. The geographic spread of public transportation in Chicago is actually very good. It's excellent. It is at a level that most cities wish they could get to. And even with that, you have inequities in the way in which we provide our service. And unfortunately, that inequity tends to be more located in lower income and socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. On top of that, as we talk about access, you have to deal with how people access our system. That gets into questions about people who have disabilities. As I indicated, I have a system that's over 125 years old. That means it's not fully accessible. People with mobility challenges are not able to use certain portions of my system because it's going to cost billions of dollars for me to basically upgrade. And so as an agency, what I'm constantly trying to do is balance the challenges and the barriers that exist to access to mobility with the options that I have available to support it. And one final complication of this whole conversation is technology. In many cities now, you're seeing other mobility options like Uber or Lyft and bike share, which are great if you have a credit card, if you have disposable income, if you can afford to pay $10 for a ride instead of $2.50 for a ride, which further exacerbates the inequities that may exist for people who are not in the same financial ability to take advantage of that, or for which the infrastructure has not been placed. So, bike share usually has, bike racks that are located in various locations for the user. Well, the question of, are they equally spread throughout the entire city, or are they located mainly in areas of the city where you feel people have more income to support a bike share program as opposed to other parts of the city? All of those are mobility issues that play out in my world that ultimately feed into and indirectly are foundational to a lot of the other challenges that you see occurring in these communities, whether it be crime, whether it be access to education, or access to healthcare, all of which tend to have some connectivity to the mobility options that they have. And so from an economic driver perspective, providing equal access to and opportunities for the use of mobility of all modes is really critical to the overall economic growth and development of the entire city, and not just portions of the city that have the financial and economic capability to take advantage of it.
Thank you so much, both Dorval and Sandra, for those more in-depth perspectives of how intersectionality affects each of your industries that you're working in. So let's talk about each of you as leaders. So Dorval already mentioned how critical and how foundational transportation and health are in everyone's life. Can each of you identify what you see as opportunities and responsibilities to equitably serve people, given the leadership roles that each of you hold? We'll start with Dorval this time.
Okay. As the head of the CTA, I certainly believe that I have a responsibility to address the mobility challenges that exist throughout the city. We are a reflection of the communities that we serve, and we have to find ways to effectively serve our communities. So what does that mean for me? One, it means constantly looking, reviewing, and having what I call our difficult conversations about the service that we're providing and how or if it is meeting the needs of the communities that we serve. It's making sure that as an agency, I have the type of diversity and inclusivity in my staff to ensure that the perspectives that are necessary to make good decisions are a part of the decision-making process. Third, it means engaging the community in dialogue around the services that you provide to get appropriate feedback and input into your decisions before they become final and not after the fact. And then third, it means working to get the financial support that allows you to provide the level of services at a cost that does not create barriers for the people who you're trying to serve, particularly those who we characterize as transit dependent, who don't have other viable options to carry out their daily lives except through their ability to access public transportation.
Thank you, Dorval. Sandra.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of conversation, certainly within our Inclusion and Diversity Council at Humana and through the network resource groups to see how we can better serve many marginalized communities. I think one thing that we have moved forward on is to try to work with organizations that support providers. So to get doctors and hospitals on board with really understanding the needs of the LGBTQ plus community, or really in terms of understanding the needs of any marginalized group. So we are working very closely with an organization called GLAMA, GLMA, which does help or provide resources for providers to get them up to speed in how to deal with the needs, say, of the transgender population. In terms of older LGBTQ plus citizens, we also work with an organization called SAGE, SAGE, which provides resources, tons of resources, and especially now with COVID, lots of resources in terms of that, how they can get the services that they need. Now, one thing Humana is working on is also the transportation piece. Humana is a big provider of plans that service Medicare members. And we are looking more and more into plans that do provide transportation, because right now that is so important. And I know, we've all seen the fact that the vaccine levels have gone down, that people aren't seeking out vaccines like they were in the beginning. But I think a lot of that is now we've gotten to a point where we're not reaching certain people. And so we need to bring those needles to the arms instead of bringing those arms to the needles. So I think that, providing transportation is going to be important in order to get care to the marginalized communities that can't otherwise. I was really happy to hear Dorval talk about food deserts, because certainly food insecurity is another thing, that Humana does address in terms of its clinical staffs and the nurses that do visit our Medicare members in their homes to make sure that they have adequate food, because that is a big problem among the elderly population as well. So.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Dorval. So both of you already alluded to some challenges, both in healthcare and in transportation, with people getting access to transportation and mobility in general. But what would you say are, I'll start with Dorval here. Dorval, what would you say are the biggest challenges that exist in achieving equity in public transit access?
It's actually pretty simple. Money. I have been on the bully pulpit of late, making the case, particularly in light of the pandemic, and the reality of the pandemic. And I was listening to Sandra talk about getting the vaccine to people, and the key is to getting needles in arms. And I know that certain communities, that has been much more of a challenge. For example, the African American community, because of some of the historical issues around the government and vaccinations and other programs. It is a very difficult conversation to get many members of our community vaccinated during this time. Mm-hmm. But the challenge to addressing issues like lower fares for people with economic challenges, or expanded service options for people who are transit dependent, always comes down to the amount of funding that public officials provide to support public transportation. And historically, and this is where, I think if there's any silver lining around the pandemic and what we've been going through, is that it's allowed us to have a conversation around equity and transportation that rarely would occur prior to the pandemic, as a direct result of the people who found themselves relying on and using public transportation more than anyone else, which were low income, minority, and economically challenged communities, who also had to make up the bulk of the essential workers who were necessary to keep the city, moving during the pandemic itself. And so historically in my world, the measure of success for transportation has been ridership. If your ridership is growing, then it is viewed as an indicator that there's demand for what you do, and therefore it becomes a litmus test for whether or not more money should be given to your agency to support it. The reality of the pandemic is that there was no money. Ridership dropped from, in my case, 1.5 million people a day to 200,000. But the need for public transportation did not change. And that was a recognition of the equitable function of what public transportation provides, and the importance as a matter of equity for its existence. That leads to a conversation about, if you view public transportation and access to mobility as an equity issue, not as a moving people from point A to point B issue, you're having a fundamentally different conversation about where it should rank in the priorities for funding to support what you need to do as a community to address the inequities that exist. And when you look at it from that perspective, then you can start having conversations about, what would it take for me to provide free rides to low-income individuals? Or what would it take for me to expand the level of service that I provide, at between midnight and 6 a.m. in the morning, when you have your third shift workers who are much more transit dependent than others during that time? And what would it take to make the infrastructure investment to start to convert my bus fleet from diesel emissions to zero emissions, and remove the healthcare challenges around air quality that predominantly impact low-income communities more than other communities in the city. We're interestingly enough in a sort of a renaissance dialogue around these types of issues that I've never been able to have before, that has been driven by the reality and the recognition that public transportation is important and public transportation is an equity equalizer for communities that desperately need and rely on it. And the challenge now is to see if we can, if we, or if I, as the leader of my organization, can convince the policymakers and elected officials who control the funding for public transit to start to fund it at a level that will allow us to address those issues in a very real and holistic way. And obviously bring the economic benefits to these communities that have been missing it for so long.
Yeah, and I was glad, Dorval, you brought up that fact about the emissions and the health concerns around the low-income neighborhoods, because I know we see that in Milwaukee too, where so many of the highways and things go through communities with people of color, and so they're dealing with the pollution from the highways. Even the ground is polluted, so to have community gardens or anything like that, is kind of a dangerous thing too. But I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with redlining and that whole piece of things. But I mean, it is so unfortunate that, racism is a public, definitely a terrible health issue because of what marginalized communities face every day.
Thank you, Dorval. Sandra, now for you, what do you believe are the most prominent challenges that exist that contribute to health disparities within the LGBTQ community?
I think the biggest one really is access to care. I do think that getting our providers educated, getting them to understand how to treat people in that community. Just to give an example, I mean, in terms of the transgender community, most of us don't have to ever answer the question, what are you? I mean, sometimes from a racial, I have friends of different races who sometimes people will say, well, what are you? Are you Hispanic? Are you whatever? But to be a trans woman or a trans man and have somebody even in the medical community ask you, what are you? And also not really know how to treat you. And then there's the problems with how claims process as well with health insurance. Most claims will deny if you are a trans woman, maybe having treatment for a prostate issue, or claims may deny if you are a trans man going in for a pap smear. So, those sorts of things, most of us don't have to deal with those sorts of issues, but it really is that education that providers need so that they're comfortable with treating primarily transgender people, but generally all LGBTQ plus people. You may notice that next to my name, I have my pronouns, she, her, hers. And that is something that's very important too, is, to get people really to address people with the pronouns that apply to them. I mean, we all have pronouns. Mine happen to match how I was born and how I, have always identified, but that may not be true for others. I mean, I use the same name I've always used my whole life, but if for some reason, a person is part of the trans community and their name changes. And yet you have people who will not use their current name. They keep referring to them by an old name or whatever, and that happens in the doctor's offices as well. Another thing I was going to mention, and I know it's not always very popular, however, Planned Parenthood is a very, very good resource for people, and I would say for any marginalized group in terms of getting services. The staff at Planned Parenthood is very well versed in LGBTQ plus issues and concerns. And, I think a lot of people have this knee-jerk sort of reaction when you talk about Planned Parenthood, but Planned Parenthood, only 3% of their services have anything to do with termination of pregnancy. So Planned Parenthood provides a lot of low cost, or in many cases, free services to marginalized groups. And like I say, they are very well trained. But the thing is, we need to get all providers and hospitals trained so that they can adequately deal with the LGBTQ plus community.
When we think about intersectionality, it's founded in identity. And there are going to be visible identities and then also invisible identities. So I think for transportation, obviously there's going to be physical handicaps, but then also intellectual disabilities and things that maybe your riders are experiencing that are not obvious by looking at them. And then the same for healthcare. There are gender, age, race that are visible, but then again, the trans individuals, or again, other types of mental health issues. How are your industries maybe approaching conversations, maybe not specific things, but just conversations regarding visible versus invisible identities with those that your industries serve?
I always make the point that CTA is a reflection of the community that we serve. And it is the societal equalizer, in that regardless of your race, your income, your background, your physical or mental disabilities, everyone ends up on a bus or train for $2.50 a trip. But what that means is that you have an intersection of all sorts of individuals who really represent a microcosm of everything that we're talking about here. And you and I, as the agency, have to find a way to allow their experience as a customer to be a positive one. And there are a number of ways that we do that. One, we have an advisory committee that is made up of organizations that represent many different types of disabilities, not just physical, but also mental and others, that provide us input. And I mentioned earlier about the importance of having diversity and inclusivity in your decision-making process, so that you are getting the type of input on things that you should do or the things that you need to address in order to support various individuals who need to use your system. That's one of the ways in which we get that kind of input at CTA. The other thing is employee training. Teaching our employees how to deal with people with various types of disabilities. Teaching them how to recognize certain disabilities. Suicide is an unfortunate but a reality of public transportation. You get people who, for whatever reason, make the decision to jump in front of a train and kill themselves. But we work hard to make sure that our employees know how to recognize, an individual or customer who may be exhibiting behavior that could suggest that there's a problem. We post information about suicide prevention at all of our stations so that they can get help if they need it. We look for ways to address the inclusivity of the variety of our customers in an anti-harassment campaign that really tries to make sure that everyone should be treated with respect. That's also carried through in our code of conduct for writing our system in terms of how you're supposed to deal with others. But I will tell you, there's one area that we are dealing with right now, and it's not unique to CTA. It's an issue throughout all public transit systems around the country that has probably been the most challenging of any, and that's homelessness. The homeless population that tends to take up riding transit as a way to provide shelter from other options that they might want to pursue or for whatever reason choose not to pursue, creates a large amount of challenges for a transit system that is not, quite honestly, a safe place for someone to stay. And how do you get those individuals help? How do you provide the support services to address them, recognizing that they have the right to decide whether they want them or not, is an ongoing challenge, and one in which we work very closely with our public health officials, with social service agencies and others to basically give them access to and express the availability of the type of services that they need to support themselves. But all of these are things that are part of what is expected of a governmental agency that provides access to everybody in the community. And if you can't feel safe participating in using my system, then I have a problem that I have to find a way to address.
And that's good to know, Dorval, because that was one of my concerns, especially around people who maybe look a little different. You look at the transgender population, or you look at a lot of, nowadays you've got, younger people too who are identifying as non-binary, queer, whatever, and they look different, and I worry about bullying and harassment and things like that with some of those people. But it sounds like, certainly in your realm, that's being cared for, which makes me really happy. But I mean, at Humana, pardon me?
Let me just say, we try to address it. I don't want to give everyone the opinion that we solved or that kind of a problem, but we recognize it. I think the first step to addressing a problem is recognizing that a problem exists. And then you work with others to find ways to solve them. We're not where we need to be, but we at least understand what we need to do.
Yeah, and that's a good start. I would say at Humana, in terms of the education we give our associates, I mean, it is very, very important to get people to understand Humana's diversity and inclusion initiatives. And we do have, like I said, our network resource groups, and we do have a network resource group for the LGBTQ community, for disabled community, which we certainly do talk, as Dorval mentioned, about invisible disabilities as well as visible disabilities. We have one for veterans, and with these groups, you don't have to be a veteran to be a member of the veteran NRG. You may be the spouse of a veteran, or you may have a brother, in the military, or maybe you just have a concern about veterans. We have obviously one for our Hispanic population, one for our Black population, for our Asian, American and Pacific Islander population. We have a women's network resource group, which in the women's network resource group, we're always looking for men to be allies. And that's a big part too we talk about is allyship. And really, how can we support all of these different communities of people, whether we're part of that community or not. And I think that's very true when you talk about intersectionality. I mean, I appear to be an older white woman, but I could have an invisible disability, or that, you know, you never know what's going on within a person. So, you know, you kind of have to assume that what you see from the outside isn't necessarily the whole person. And I think that's very important as well. So, but I have to say, I can't be happier in terms of working for a company that really provides and incentivizes people too. We have a program whereby associates can take different courses and things around inclusion and diversity. And, you know, they win bucks, you know, which they can use toward gift cards and things of that nature. You know, so I have a nice Amazon bank because of the gift cards that I've been able to earn, you know. So I mean, we try to get people certainly at all levels of the business, from our leadership down, to actually understand and get involved in these initiatives that Humana provides and educational opportunities.
You know, Sandra, you made a point that I think is really critical, and it's certainly one that I view in terms of my role as the head of the agency, which is you have to not only talk the talk, you have to walk the walk. Mm-hmm. You know, I have to show through my own actions how I am supportive of the efforts for inclusivity and diversity within my organization and within the community that we serve, mm-hmm. by doing the things that ultimately show my active engagement in these issues. And that includes, you know, I've taken the training. We offer the harassment training for all of our employees. Mm-hmm. When I say all of our employees, that includes the president. You know, it's not like I can tell everyone else this is what you need to do, and you know, you tell me how it goes. I participate in group sessions talking about inclusivity and diversity, and I go out and publicly, you know, advocate around it, and share that advocacy with my employees so that they know, mm-hmm. that I'm out there in a public way making the case for the things that we're talking about. If the organization as a whole isn't capable of grasping the issues we're talking about, then it's very hard for the people who are being impacted by that organization to get the benefit of the issues that we're talking about. You know, I have this saying that I say to my peers when we talk about diversity and inclusivity, and it basically is, if you're asking the right questions, then you should be having difficult conversations. And if you're not having difficult conversations, then you're not asking the right questions. Because the discussion around diversity and inclusivity is sometimes a very uncomfortable, mm-hmm. conversation to have, but it's a necessary one. And if anything, the activities that we've seen over the past year and the focus that has been brought around issues of equity and inclusivity in cases like the George Floyd case and others, has allowed for a level of conversation and dialogue around these topics that in some ways has not happened the way it's been happening recently. And I think the challenge is how you keep that dialogue going, because at the end of the day, it's that dialogue that really drives the type of initiative and decision-making that ultimately provides for the best support for the barriers to those issues. And, you know, the way in which you do that, you're absolutely right that hiring is a challenge in a public agency, but it's not so much of a challenge that I can't address diversity in my management team and in the decision-making people of my staff. And I work very hard to make sure that I do have a level of diversity in my decision-making team so that we do get the type of input. And I think particularly as a governmental agency, it's absolutely critical that you have that kind of input, because you're representing the same diversity that you're making these decisions for. And if you don't have people who reflect the community that you serve, mm-hmm. in positions, mm-hmm. to make decisions around that community, then I guarantee you're going to have some problems. Mm-hmm. And so as a CEO, I'm one who's trying to avoid as many problems as possible, Lord knows there are enough problems I deal with just from running transit every day. But these are areas where you can avoid self-inflicted wounds and really put in place the type of environment and the type of staff that will give the type of input and feedback that's necessary to make the right decisions, or at least the best decisions, to address diversity and inclusivity in our organization and in our service.
You know, you might have to educate yourself. You might have to take it upon yourself really to educate yourself and learn more about a certain community. I know one thing that I am trying to increase my knowledge of now, certainly given everything that's happening in our society, is the Asian and Pacific Islander population, to see how in the Green Bay community I can be more of an ally. We do have a large Hmong population here, so I'm looking for ways that I can be supportive of them and let them know that I am there for them if they need me. But, every community needs allies. And so, the more you can learn about allyship and the more you can find ways that you can help, the better off everyone will be. So that's it.
I think Sandra hit the nail on the head. And I would, I think reiterate what she just said, which is the key to successfully addressing this issue is engagement. And it requires the engagement of all of us to really ensure that programs and policies and communities reflect the level of inclusivity and diversity that we should expect in this day and age in the communities that we live in. And it's going to look very different depending upon where you live. I mean, Sandra in Green Bay is very different than Dorval in Chicago. But the issues are still the same. And whether it's, doing like Kent did and joining a community group to fight for, housing in your community, or whether it's just voting for elected officials who you believe support the policies and beliefs that we're talking about here, it's really important that everyone engage, because that's the only way you bring about effective change. And with that change, I believe, come good results. So I think that's all I want to say, and just reiterating what Sandra said, because I think she said it beautifully. As a product of Carroll University, we learned a lot about ethos and how important it is to be together as a community and supportive of each other as a community. Those same principles apply long after you graduate from Carroll and are out in the real world. And if you follow those same principles, I guarantee you that you will feel like you are actually participating in things that are good for the community as a whole.
Wow. Thank you to both of you. That was beautifully said. That was definitely a mic drop moment. Thank you again so much, Sandra and Dorval, for your time tonight, sharing your experience and expertise. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all of our attendees for taking the time to engage tonight. So stay connected and stay tuned. We will continue more alumni engagement activities, whether that's virtual or hopefully soon to come in person. So thank you again so much, and take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.